So before we can get to that stuff, we need to talk about a really important kind of category which arose out of this cognitive categorization work. One of the things that arose was image schemas. So I think people have some awareness in here of image schemas, at least most people do. I'm going to warn you in advance that we don't have them in FrameNet yet, but the motion frames were designed to be consistent with the idea. We also do have some of this stuff which will be appearing in the official release of FrameNet, the next one. I have produced about certainly more than 100 frames. I don't remember the exact count, but there's 100 frames that are sitting on Wiki. But because it's a lot of work to do 100 frames, we haven't taken it off of the Wiki and put it in the database yet. But, you know, we'll look forward to that in the not very distant future. So here, these concepts are getting to be more and more directly relevant to our work in FrameNet. Here we have a very basic presentation of how prepositions work. So in general, if you have a sentence like, I put my keys in the box, then the preposition in is going to evoke a scene, which we're going to talk about next. But even more basically, almost every kind of preposition evokes what can be called a trajector landmark schema. And really the idea is very simple. Some things we know the location of, and the only way that we can establish in language the location of things that we don't know the location of is by comparing them to things that we do know the location of. So I have to start with something that I assume we all know. So I assume we know what the box is, or at least good enough. And then I inform you about where the keys end up, because I'm defining that relative to the box. So that relation gives you the two, what you can either call roles of the schema, or in FrameNet terms, frame elements of the schema. There's not actually any deep difference. So the trajector is the thing which we're trying to specify the location of. The landmark is the thing we already know the position of. We combine this with container schema. So the container schema in general has a container and an interior. So there's also exterior, there's a bunch of other roles. Optionally, there's a portal. There's lots of things that you have in a container schema. But you combine this with trajector and landmark in a particular kind of way. Often, what is done in cognitivist descriptions of this is slightly wrong. So the simplest idea would be to say, well, the container is the landmark, and the trajector is the interior. Now, if I actually say it out loud that way, then you can see that there's something weird and wrong about it. But if I just draw some little arrows, then it isn't so obvious that this is wrong. So we wouldn't, in FrameNet terms, we wouldn't want to identify the frame element of interior with the landmark, with the trajector. We need to do something more complicated. Okay? So the first thing to say is that we need more roles. So whenever we're locating something, so going back to the trajector landmark scene, we explicitly have the roles for the trajector and the landmark. But we also need a role for a region that the trajector is going to fit inside of, and that region is defined relative to the landmark. So in the case of the container schema, the active zone or profiled region, you can use either name, is going to be the interior. And that is what actually gets bound. One other thing to note is that potentially there's also a difference between container and landmark, because some of the descriptions of container say that it's just the outside, the thing that defines the boundary. Some of them, and that's the most natural interpretation of container. I mean, if you're just using the natural word. Others of them say, well, this isn't actually the normal category of container. It's either the exterior or the exterior plus the interior. And for cases like, if I'm saying something is in the body, then, I don't want to say that there's an interior in the sort of natural, normal linguistic sense of the word. So we just have to be very careful about how we define these things. And in fact, each of those defines slightly different schemas that will be relevant for the description of some languages and some constructions. In order to point out that there are such difficulties, I have a little exercise for us. Oops, that's not it. Where did it go? Here we go. Okay. So here you have some English sentences. And I have marked the ones that seem really weird with a hash mark. I'm almost allergic to the asterisk for ungrammaticality, especially because this is a conceivable sentence. It's just, it doesn't mean the right thing. And this is similar. So I went in the room, and I can also say I went into the room, both perfectly fine. I went in the door versus I went into the door. This one would mean that I actually penetrate the door, that I go into the interior of the door itself. That's probably not what somebody meant. So they probably shouldn't say that. Unless that somebody is a termite. So viewpoint is everything. Then in the last example, and by the way, I even surprised Len Tolmie with this one because he had never noticed this distinction. You can say, I went into the field, and there is no problem. Doesn't matter what kind of field it is. But if you say, I went in the field, it's without a lot of context, it sounds really weird. So I'm actually going to ask you guys if you can figure out from this, or asking me more questions, what is the reason? What are the parameters of the different image schemas that are going on here? So I'm going to claim in advance that these all reference the container schema. They definitely, the construction, this use of in, this use of in, this use of into, this use of into, they all reference the container schema. But they reference subtypes of it. They have special properties. So let's see if we can figure out what those are. So can you pass the microphone to this side of the room? Okay, we'll start here.
Hello.
Will you speak in Portuguese or?
I can speak in English. I think that I went in the field is kind of weird because field is kind of an open place. I don't know. It's so the image I get is of an open place, a vast place. So in is more in the context of a room, a door, a smaller container kind. It is more a feel. I don't know if I'm right.
You are really getting in the right direction, but let me push on a couple of things. So I will point out, first of all, that it is not strictly about size, because I can also say I went in the aircraft hangar. So an aircraft hangar is very big, but I can still use in.
Yeah.
So why?
It's about the kind of place. I don't know.
The
It's
kind
open.
of, use the terms that we have here. What is the place that you're talking
The
about?
field.
No, use the role names.
I forgot.
Okay, I'll go back.
Really.
Um,
The
so
interior. The container is an open container, and its interior is kind of, I don't know.
So the openness is absolutely right. I'll just go ahead and tell you that part.
Thanks.
So you don't have to struggle anymore with that. So
I'm
that
trying to figure out, but no.
no, that's totally right. It's the openness is the difference.
And into the field, it gets that feel of openness, of vastness.
Yeah. So my next question is, so if we want to call the field a container, if it's open, how is it a container? So we can use into the room, and we can also use into the field.
It's an open container in the case.
Okay, so let's be more specific.
It's not a closed container.
But what is an open container? I mean, a container should be something that has boundaries, right?
Right.
So what do you mean by open versus closed?
Ah, my God.
You have suffered enough. You can pass the microphone.
Thank you.
Yeah. And by the way, you're doing an excellent job. So we're already in the vicinity. Pass forward.
Nobody wants the mic.
Well, somebody's going to have to take the mic. Vast quantities of buck passing taking place. We have a volunteer in the back? Okay, great.
Sound
Woohoo!
test,
Actual
yes.
volunteers. I always appreciate that. I really do.
So I think it has to do with boundaries, borders. For example, okay, room, door, field are room and door maybe are limited, and also the field, although it's open, it's limited. It has a border, a limitation. Maybe it's just a guess.
Yeah, that's right. I'm just going to make it slightly more precise, just so it's really clear to everybody what we're talking about. In one case, the boundary is a physical entity. Not only that, it's a physical entity that prevents crossing. So in the cases within, like I went in the room, for motion, you need a physical entity that would prevent motion normally. So the room has walls, actual real physical entities that prevent you from going there. But the field doesn't. So now that we've gotten this far, I have another question. Under what circumstances would the field example work? So I went in the field. What's an example where that would work? What's an example where, just to be precise about it, where a field has a definite physical boundary that prevents motion? And you can pass the microphone.
Can you repeat the question, please?
So the idea is we have gotten as far as the following, that you can use, with motion, you can use in to refer to, in the case where you have a landmark which has a definite physical boundary that prevents motion. So can you describe a scene where I could actually say this sentence? So I can always say this one. I went into the field because into All it requires is that there be some boundary. It doesn't have to be a boundary that prevents motion, nothing like that.
I can't. I think we
Okay.
can.
All right, well, did we have another volunteer down here? We have a volunteer over here.
I was thinking about like soccer field and stadium.
Yep, so stadium, in fact, if you look in a corpus and you look for these examples, what you're going to find is sports fields. In fact, it's actually even better if there is a visual barrier. So the best examples are cases where people have built a wall around a field that actually prevents you from even seeing in there. So I found a few examples that were like that. But not very many, because mostly fields aren't like that. Okay? Now we have one last example, which I think is easier. So why is it that I can say I went in the door, but I can't say I went into the door to mean the same thing? So how is this one referencing a container schema? I mean, we've already established that into is very broad. It doesn't care what kind of container it is, any kind of container. So what's the difference? So if you could pass the microphone to the back, all the way over.
So, I think that it's because I went into the door. I need to have the interior, the door in this way. I don't have the interior there where I can get into.
That's exactly right. But now we have to wonder what's going on in this example. So there is no interior of the door in this example. Why not?
I don't know, because you're going to pass through the door. Because the door would be the place through which you pass, depending on taking the door as the space through where I pass, not the door, the wooden part.
Yep.
Yep. See?
So, oh, we have another comment here or question.
A question. We can think about the door as a metonymic for the room.
Think about it as the metonymic for the room. That's conceivable. However, if that were true, then you should be able to say this one. Right? If it's a free metonymy, then if the door stands for the room, then that one should be okay too. So actually, I think that she had the right idea. That basically, what you need, you would love to say that there's actually only one in, but that would be wrong. Actually, what you need is a separate role. So the door is not filling the container role. It's filling what has been called the portal role. So there's a special role then in the container schema for the thing that you traverse in order to get into or out of a space. And this one picks out that part of the scene instead. Thiago.
Would it be okay to say that those two propositions in fact profile different orientational aspects of the container schema? In the sense that in, at least as it seems to me, is profiling the vertical aspect of the container schema, while into profiles the horizontal aspect. So you don't need a barrier in into. In fact, what you need is to define what would be the horizontal barriers or the horizontal boundaries, not barriers, of room and field. That's why you could only went into the door if you were a thermite, because you would be dealing with the horizontal barrier. or boundary, not barrier, of the door. The area, okay?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying.
And when you say I went in the room or in the door, I do understand that the door is not the container. However, it's the portal is also a vertically oriented participant.
So it's a lovely hypothesis, but it's not actually borne out by further data in this case. So the reason why not is because even if the motion is completely vertical, these same judgments don't change. So I can go, for example, I can go in the manhole. A manhole is a thing in the street that you use to access the sewer. And the motion is completely up-down, but you say in, because it's just about whether you're going through a portal. And you also still can't say into, right? You don't go into the manhole, right? And again, you can say I went into the sewer, and that's fine, because it's a real area that has, because into will allow anything. You can also say I went in the sewer because it's a real area that has definite boundaries. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but the fact is not, I wasn't trying to say that the movement is vertically oriented or
What you're saying is
horizontally,
that
but the
the
perception of the container
I see. So
might
you're
be,
saying that one of these is 3D,
yeah.
and the other one is 2D.
Yes.
Perceptually as a landmark. I'll think about it for a moment. In the field. So you're saying that in is a three-dimensional.
Yeah, you would have
Okay.
absolutely at least the vertical axis, all right, that has to be taken into consideration, while when you say I went into the room or into the field, then you only have the area.
It doesn't work because if you have, I mean, it's rare to have it in simple cases, but you put a check mark in the box, and the box, in this case, is a metaphorical box that is only two-dimensional, but no one would have any problem with that. Do you see what I mean? Yes. So that may be a component of the solution. I'll have to think about it for sure. That's interesting. But at the very least, I can think of some examples that would require us to elaborate it more, to be more specific about what we mean by 3D and 2D. Okay? One last terrible thing that I will point out about all of this is that when you switch to a stative perspective, this difference disappears. So obviously, in a stative perspective, I can't use into at all, right? So something is in the box, it's not into the box, right? So in that case, I can say I was standing in the field, or I was standing in the room. So we have to note that we can't just define a set of characteristics that's just going to work as a slice for all the possible uses of the thing. No, we have to distinguish between the features of static versus goal-oriented versus portal-oriented versus et cetera, right? So all of these are separate features, and each of the individual prepositions are going to pick out some subset of combinations of those features, right? But not going to pick out whole slices where you just set this value for this feature and then everything else can just be freely available. It can vary between any of the other values. So this is a much simpler example than what Lakoff talked about in Women, Fire, and Dangerous Things, but it shows the same phenomena, that the category, if I want to say there is a category of in, the category that's picked out by that spatial preposition, it's not a simple category. I can't just list the features, bam, 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 and then all the examples are going to have those features. And in fact, we can see that in a case like I was standing in the field and I went in the room, that the characteristics actually have no overlap. Because standing in the field is static and does not require a physical boundary, whereas I went in the room is dynamic, it's goal-oriented, and it does require a physical barrier, right? Okay. Now, here we go to... Okay. I could talk a whole bunch more about image schemas if you want. Actually, I will spend a couple minutes on that because there's some important points that we haven't hit. The whole idea behind image schemas grew out of work from Leonard Talmy. Leonard Talmy went around figuring out what were the semantic characteristics that let you figure out which preposition you would use in a particular circumstance. Or in general, under which circumstances you would use what are called closed class items. So just first of all, before I go any further, how many people have heard of the idea of closed class items? Does this make any sense to anybody? Okay, it doesn't sound like that's something you're very familiar with. So the idea is that if you look at a language, there are some categories of words which you can freely add to. So in any language, you have to be able to have new nouns because you're going to see new things all the time. And you already have a huge number of nouns in any language. Every language in the world has a huge number of category names for entities. It's a large part of what's going on in our world. And in fact, it makes a lot of sense because it's a large part of what's going on in your brain. There's the entire pathway going from the back of your brain to the temporal lobe, which is all about what category something fits into. So there's a huge number of them, and it's open. You can just add to it, make a new noun, and add it to your system. Verbs are also, at least in almost all languages, an open category because there's a lot of different actions. Adjectives, again, for most languages, descriptions, words that describe things, are an open category. Adverbs, similarly, they're describing things, and who knows how you might want to describe things. But prepositions and spatial relations, however you do that in your language, usually those things are closed classes. Now the reason for that, possibly, is that there are a limited number of ways that we actually understand space. And those limited number of ways that are available to us are really, really neurological. So we know something about the visual perception system, which is a large part of how we understand space. In fact, for people who are blind or people who are in a dark room and trying to figure out where things are, they have put people in neural scanners to find out what part of their brain is active. And the same parts of the brain that handle spatial location for people watching things are handling spatial location when you are either permanently or temporarily blind, but keeping track of locations that are not within reach. So somewhere right around here. But the real estate that's available for that is limited. There's only a certain number of relations that we can have, and conceptually, relations are more complex than simple categories or just categorizing something as moving or not moving. So because these relations are complex, they take up a lot of brain space. We seem not to have more than a limited number of them sort of built in. So the one thing I really wanted to emphasize is that of all of the things that we have done in cognitive linguistics, the aspect which, to me, has always most cried out for embodiment, for paying attention to the detailed characteristics of the human mind, is spatial relations. For me, it's a very obvious case, because it's really obvious that if you were designing a computer, or let's even say a robot, to understand space, you wouldn't design it to have the same categories that we have. And when I say the same categories that we have, I don't just mean the ones that we have in English. I mean the way that it works in any language in the world. One of the ways in which it's different is that there are a number of things that have been discovered to never differentiate the meaning of closed class items. One of those things is scale. So there is no preposition that will actually tell you whether something is small or large. It may say something about relative size, but it's not actually going to tell you how big it is in absolute terms. Only open class items will ever tell you actual sizes. So this is actually really important for understanding how people think and how we naturally do thinking. Okay, does that make sense to people? You understand what I'm saying? It's also really important to realize that probably we're never going to even be tempted to make a frame distinction between things based on size. It should make perfect sense, but it would be if you were designing a robot. Because, of course, a robot is going to interact very differently with small things, with big, medium-sized things, and with big things. It's true for people too. But it seems that that's not how our categorization system works. It's not for purely simple function reasons. It's not for reasons that any cognition would have to be this way. It really is a product of the particular way that our cognitive system works. And there are some reasons that people have provided for evolutionary pressure that make our category system work this way. For example, the fact that when you look off in the distance and you see something that looks very small, well, it looks very small, but you know that it's actually larger than the amount of the visual space that it's taking up. So, you know, there is this property of the visual system where the amount of visual real estate that something takes up, we learned very early that that is not important except to categorize how far away it is and entangled with how big the thing is. So because of that, we have to sort of unlearn something that would be very basic, right? I mean, we have direct access to our visual field. We know, in theory, how much visual space something is taking up, but we ignore that information for categorization because it doesn't prove to be useful as we grow up and develop. Okay? This is part of all of the basic cognitive systems. They all have characteristics that make them useful in the evolutionary long haul. This is also really important for judging whether our category systems are just linguistic or whether they are more generally cognitive. Because the same pressures that would make a human to not differentiate between the amount of visual field taken up as a distinct category would have the same effects in apes. Anything that has a visual field and is able to do thinking about it. In fact, that's been experimentally confirmed. creatures don't categorize on the basis of amount of visual space taken up. So what this tells us is that these categories that we're discovering in this way are actually related to pre-linguistic categorizations, meaning both humans before they learn language and in critters running around in the wild. And this erodes the distinction between linguistic cognition and general cognition, which I find to be one of the most important insights in cognitive science. That language is special in that it makes the categories explicit, but it's not special that categories exist in language. And the categories that exist in language exist in general. Okay. One distinction between the way Ptolemy, go ahead. Oh, thanks. One distinction between the way Ptolemy organizes his description of these closed class items and the way that we at FrameNet organize the same content is that Ptolemy does everything in terms of features and never puts those things together into a gestalt. So the only thing I want to note is that that's really all you have to do, is you take the features that Ptolemy has figured out, and we believe in those 100%. You take those features and you figure out how they come together to form useful categories in your language. Now, knowing something about some other languages that are very different from English, some Southeast Asian languages, for example, I know that the frame hierarchy for motion and location would be very different in those languages. But the most basic categories, static versus dynamic, container versus not container, those things are going to be elements in any of those systems that we've ever seen. Okay. I'm going to spend the last little bit of the class talking about the general utility of FrameNet for cognitive science in general, and more specifically focusing on metaphor, which is a current project that we have at ICSI. So one thing that we might lose track of, but which is actually really important, is that FrameNet is the most extensive project that is consistent with the current understanding of cognition. There is no project that has ever been done that has more material which is linguistically related to the structure of our cognition. There's WordNet, it's out there, but it was not intended to be, it was not designed to be consistent with cognitive principles, and in fact, if you look at the categorization system, it's not. It's one of the problems with WordNet. And as far as non-lexical resources, I mean, there are many studies, many people have done many things. If you put together all the material of all the other stuff, it would add up to a lot. And a lot of it is, of course, more interesting because it's languages other than English, right? I mean, English gives you one very narrow viewpoint on what category systems can be like. But it's a very deep perspective. And we also do have FrameNets in other languages, as you know. There are interesting things that can be pointed out about that already. The other thing that's really important to note is that it really has the properties that we need for a much more formalized cognitive representation than what people have been using before. So for one thing, it represents the stable structure of cognitive connections. We know that there's a lot of stuff that happens in context, dynamically. That's not actually what FrameNet represents. So it actually is much more possible to have a much more limited and definite set of things that you can describe. It also is highly multidimensional, and it connects all the concepts in meaningful ways that we know repeat again and again across different languages. So why do we need something like that for metaphor? Well, I hope it's obvious. Because let's imagine for a moment that you want to study metaphors in different languages. You want to know a really fundamental question. Are metaphors the same or are they different? Well, when we describe metaphors, we describe them in terms of a source domain and a target domain, right? As we've discussed before. The source domain is the richly embodied frame or set of image schemas, whatever you want to call it, that we do most of our simulation of the content in. And the target domain is the final understanding that we want that is enriched by mapping from the source domain. But whenever we describe a metaphor just using everyday words, as is done in the literature, it might not be clear whether those categories are the same. So you have a category on each side, source domain, target domain. How do I tell whether those categories are the same? So one suggestion is if you use FrameNet, at least in theory, people have done a lot of work to define the category extremely carefully. That's what we do. And we define it language internally, but then that also means that if in another language the concept is different, then hopefully they use a different frame for that. And again, if there were metaphors in both languages going from those two different frames, you would be able to say, you would be able to make predictions about how the metaphors would be different. So I'll give you a tiny example. So in English, we have a very different way of organizing the motion system than you have in, certainly in Spanish. I'm going to be more wary about saying anything about Portuguese by projection. So in Spanish, the motion system is what's called verb framed. What that means is that the place where you find out how things were located relative to other things, that's in the verb. Whereas in English, most of the time you find out that information from a preposition. So in Spanish, if in English I had something like I ran into the room, in Spanish I would most comfortably translate this as entré corriendo. Right? So I would reformat things so that the information goes into the right place. What this means in terms of cognitive salience, though, is that for English speakers, manner is very salient. We put it in the main verb. And it's sort of not optional because, you know, in the sentence, we're going to have a verb. We might not have the other stuff, but we're going to have the verb. So we're always mentioning the manner. Even if I just say I was running, then we do, or if we have additional information. That's not true in Spanish, right? So in Spanish, the verb contains the image schema information, and so that's always going to be there, right? So entrar, salir, and things like that, subir, whatever. All of these reference image schemas. And the other part, the manner information, from this perspective, is sort of optional. It's less salient. So then we can ask, how does this affect basic metaphors? So we have a lot of metaphors that relate motion to, for example, states. Okay? So one thing that's very different, sorry, I need to back up slightly. One thing that's also different about these two systems, just before we get to the metaphor part, is that whenever you're talking about a verb-framed language, the majority of the verbs that are talking about your spatial location are punctual. They're talking about a state change. So entrar and salir are punctual verbs, right? That's really different from running into the room. So the English speaker's conception is that it's the whole event from outside the room, through the door, and into the room. And that's the part that shows up in metaphorical differences. So if you look in a corpus for change as location metaphors. So these, just to remind you, these are cases where you say things like the prices went from high to low, right? Or I turned into a dragon, right? So both of those kinds of things. One thing that seems to be very different, not in terms of possibility, but in terms of frequency, is that in English, we have a lot of state change metaphors that are talking about a continual change. Okay? So things like the prices are running higher. And typically, if you look at a Spanish translation of a text that says something like that, then they say something like, either they translate just into the target domain and they say the prices are increasing, and that's fine, that totally works, or they focus on the fact that the prices have gotten high by saying, what is it? Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot the translation. It's not ir por alto. I don't remember. But basically they talk about the prices arriving at the state of being high. So things like llegar en alto. And in a case like that, it's not a huge change, right? I mean, there's a reason why it's an okay translation, but you can suspect that if it shows up in translation, it also shows up in the native produced sentences, and I have some frequency information that bears that out. And you can also bet that this influences how people think about the categories. And in the project that we're doing at ICSI, we actually have partners in cognitive psychology departments who are actually going to stick people in brain scanners and figure out whether these metaphorical distinctions are really there, that whether there are cross-linguistic differences in metaphorical conception based on the cross-linguistic differences in the source domain conception. So this is open research. I have some suggested results just based on frequency differences in text, but it's only suggestive so far. Okay? So I'm just going to end it there, I think, after asking you guys whether you have any questions over what we're up to. So the assignment is to take a frame that you understand and try to make it more embodied.
Could you give them an example, or have you already given when
Yeah.
I was outside?
I gave, okay, I consider the examples I was giving about the location to be that. So in FrameNet, if you look in FrameNet right now, all we have is locative relation. That's it. It's just that everything which is some kind of locative relation is there in the same place. But we know from a cognitive perspective that actually the way that we process is quite different depending on whether it's a container schema, a proximity schema, some other schema. And that should make a difference in how we categorize things there. So I will suggest that if you look at the set of emotion frames, things like being angry, that you might find some rich ground for making things more embodied than they are now. Okay?
Okay.
There are other places you could look, including looking for what can be called covert metaphors. So think about some of the most common metaphors. They're not encoded in FrameNet right now. Okay? So for that, you might, I suggest, look in the communication domain. Okay? Or you could look in the cognition domain. You could try those things.
Okay.
Okay? Does that make some sense?
Yeah. Can I give them an example in Portuguese?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. Pessoal, então a ideia...
All right, the idea here, as you noticed, as we look for a frame on FrameNet that have frame elements and try to add to this definition an incorporated thing based on what, to what extent these frames that have a metaphorical degree can be treated under the perspective of corporification of language. For instance, a good example is a frame of goal or purpose. You're going to find the notion of target. In the frame of goal, somebody wants to hit a target. When we say that he wants to hit a target, we are using a metaphor that the destined is a trajectory. We have if I studied, for instance, I studied hard to pass the test, so pass the test is my target. So it's an example of metaphorical incorporation in this frame in a more perpetual domain in this. So the movement towards a physical target is much more basic, much more corporified than the idea of trying to hit a target. So we use some prepositions, locative prepositions to talk about goal. When I can say, you have to study for the test to pass, so over there. So over there is like the end of the trajectory. Of course, you can use this example I just given you, okay? So see you tomorrow.